First of all, thank you so much for joining me. The arrival of the digital era has shaken the foundations of the modern education system. And what would you say is the biggest challenge you face as an educator at this moment in time?
It's slightly hard to pick one. I think there are multiple challenges. I suppose I would conceptualize them as two, really. The first is simply that the way that education works has been the same for sort of the last 200 years, right? It's a knowledge-based system. If I think there's a phrase that actually I will quote is from Tom Fletcher, who points out if you took a doctor from 150 years ago and you put them in a modern hospital, they'd probably be totally at sea with how medicine works currently. But if you took a teacher from 150 years ago and you put them in a modern classroom, it would look very similar to the way it looked 150 years ago. We're still knowledge-based. We're still working on a model where teachers are the holders of that knowledge and they pass that to children. And then we rank our children on their ability to reproduce that knowledge in examination conditions. So challenge one is that if we look at what AI and technology is going to do to our society, I think what we're going to see is it's going to displace a lot of knowledge-based industries, knowledge-based roles, which have been the entire purpose of our education system. And so I think it's a very fundamental challenge to whether the heart of our education system should be knowledge-based or should be pivoting to think more creatively or differently about what skills we need to equip our young people with. But because the system has been the same for the last 200 years, and because every stakeholder in the system has never known anything else, I think it's very difficult for the education system to really consider a very fundamental change. So that's sort of challenge one. And challenge two, I think, is speed. As I was saying to my staff, if I could choose, firstly, I would absolutely try and slow down this technological change. We are moving, in my opinion, much, much too fast. There is no control on this development of AI, and there's no strategic thought or infrastructure around how we manage it. It is absolutely a Wild West, and I think that's unwise, but it's not something that I can control. And if I could choose how to move an education system that's been the same for the last 200 years through change, I wouldn't want to do it at the speed that I think is going to be necessary. So I think the first challenge is that you have a system that has never changed, and you have people in that system who've never really considered change. And the second thing is that the speed that we're going to need to change is probably not ideal.
Who are the people who are controlling this, and what more can we do as individuals, as educationalists, as policy? Do we just have to rely on the policymakers? What do you see the solution for slowing this down?
I think a lot about this because I am, as an individual and as a leader of young people, I am deeply concerned. What I need is the attention. So I need governments to be paying attention to the information that we're getting from the tech industry, many of whom are stepping forward to say, we need to slow this down. We need to take very proactive action. This should be our primary point of focus now for all governments worldwide, because the impact of this technology, in my opinion, could be and it's not my opinion based off my reading and my talking to key stakeholders. It could disrupt democracy in the next 2 years, right? It could fundamentally undermine the way in which liberal democracies work. And yet we're still talking about small things we've always talked about. We need global focus on this. Like, if we were picking an ideal strategy, I think we would use nuclear disarmament as an example, right? Like, we need governments to work collaboratively because it's a global issue. So they need to be paying attention, and they need to be talking to the key stakeholders, and they need to be prioritizing it as a matter of urgency to have policy and global agreement on how we move forward. Because at the moment, there is none. And you're even seeing the key leaders in those areas, people who are pushing that technology at the same time saying, we need to stop the technology. So there's a cultural problem here, and there's an attention problem here. So in terms of as an individual, I think we have to try and get our governments to pay attention. And I think that is writing to your representatives. I think it is lobbying governments. Like, we need government organizations right now to put focus in this area and to work collaboratively on how we strategically think about how to move forward.
And one of the big disruptors that you've talked about, that everyone seems to be talking at the moment, is artificial intelligence. And listening to you talk earlier this year, you were saying about, how it could and potentially should revolutionize our education system. How do you see this happening?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I spoke to staff at the beginning of the academic year, And I think teaching is a really interesting example of how AI is going to intersect. The first thing I think that's interesting on that is what I would call as a debater a framing problem, where people are asking the wrong questions right now. So at the moment in education, we are looking at, say, something like ChatGPT, large language models, and sort of saying, okay, children can use that to write essays. How do we stop them doing that? How do we stop them cheating? How do we, etc.? But that's really not the question. If ChatGPT can write a better essay than an A-level student, which it usually can, the question isn't how do I stop the student using ChatGPT? The question is, why am I investing so much of their educational time in teaching them to write essays? So I think there is a piece here around we need to think about not just how we use technology to deliver the same way that we've always delivered, but how technology fundamentally changes what we need to deliver. So that's, I guess, point one. And the second thing I think I said to teachers was, you know, when COVID happened and all the teaching moved online, and for schools like the Ladies' College, we were already in a really good position because we are quite technologically advanced college. So it was very smooth for us and we could move just online. But there was a lot of kind of speculation across the UK and wider that now what we would see is this amazing democratization of learning, right? That you could film the very best teachers, you could have online activities, and suddenly all children with a device could access the best education that's possible. But actually what happened was for the vast majority of children, that system didn't work at all. Because fundamental to human learning is human interaction. And so you can have a video of the very best teaching. Like you could do an entire Harvard degree right now for free, right? It's all online, but people don't, because actually what you need is that human storytelling, that human connection, that sense of ability to understand and unlock you, to like ask you the questions at the right moment, to inspire you, to keep you on task. So we really saw in that the distinction between what technology can offer and what is, perhaps because we've evolved as human animals, necessary for human learning. So when I speak to the staff, I'm very clear, I don't think they'll be out of a job in 10 years. But I'm also very clear that in 10 years, I don't think their day will look the same. I do not think they will be standing in front of a classroom of 25 to 30 children delivering knowledge. I do not see that that is the value that they add. Right? I think that technology will do a lot of that work, and that their value will be in having the difficult conversations, in like asking the questions, in walking alongside young people and unlocking potential. And so for us, the question is, how do we start to move the skills of our staff and the culture of our schools from where it is at the moment to where it will need to be?
So there's a lot of uncertainty as we look to the future. So how can we adapt and assimilate modern technology within our education system, but frame within the context of the real and present risks that the digital age poses, particularly regarding data protection, oversharing online, and social media in general?
So I think, again, there's two sides to this question. I'll take the second side first, which is that we need to steadily start to build the skills of our young people and our staff's comfort with using technology to unlock the potential of young people. That's, you know, we're going to have to experiment. For us, what we've done is set up an AI working group, working with universities like UCL on the very latest technology. And then when they find something very useful, disseminating that out to the wider staff so we can actually constantly be updating our skills. But I think a more complicated question is around the impact that technology has on us as humans, and the impact it particularly has on children and teenagers' minds. And so for me, there is I'm a psychologist by background, sort of neuropsychology is sort of my area of interest. And there's a very clear distinction for me between, for me, working on a Word document or, you know, solving puzzles online with what you get in what I call scrolling type situations, right? Like where you're getting constant new information that is creating a dopamine reward system that keeps you scrolling for hours, so that and we all know it, me as an adult knows it as much as a teenager, I can lose hours of my day. And if you asked me what I learned in that last hour, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you. What it's putting me into is a state of like constant low level stimulation. And I have real concerns about what that's doing to everybody's brains. We're not designed, like we have not evolved to have that dopamine stimulation. Like that was meant, you know, I spent a lot of time in Africa. I lived there for 8 years. If you look at the tribes that live there in very traditional, lifestyles, they'll spend most of their day doing nothing, like sitting on a rock, bored. And then very occasionally a lion comes out, right? That is what our brain has evolved to, is just to have stimulation on occasional moments. And we have now created something that puts us into that state of stimulation in a constant rolling cycle. I think that's bad for us. I think we can see that we're addicted to it. It's an addiction mechanism, right? Like it works similarly to other kinds of addiction. But when you think about young people's brains, I think that there are much more significant impacts there in terms of neuroplasticity and how our brain is shaping. And we can see this dramatic rise in anxiety and mental health issues in all generations, but in particular young people, over the last 12 years. And it directly correlates to the advent of the smartphone. And they've now got causal evidence demonstrating that the amount of time you're spending on a smartphone, in particular things like social media or scrolling like TikTok, YouTube, where you're getting that constant stimulation, directly causes an increase in depression and anxiety, which from a neurobiological perspective is not surprising, because I'm keeping my brain, I'm getting my brain used to constant stimulation. And when you take that away, then I therefore feel anxious. So I really wonder whether we are going to learn that we've done something very unwise in unleashing this technology with no caveats. When you talk to parents, they'll say, "Oh, I can't take the phone away from my daughter or my son. They'll lose their temper. They'll go nuts." And if you think about it, that's a drug response, right? Like, my child is on a drug. If I take the drug away, they go nuts because they need it. But that's the very reason we have to take it away. So one of my first things at the college was, my first assembly to the girls was to explain why I'm not having mobile phones in school, that they need at least 8 hours a day where their brain is not on that technology. And I do think that the mechanism for that is very different from the mechanism for using a computer to learn. Like, I don't think these two things are the same. We sometimes group them the same and talk about screen time. The evidence on screen time is fine. It's about what is happening in that system. So yeah, I really wonder if we're going to see in 10 years' time governments imposing bans the way that we prevent kids vaping and smoking and taking alcohol to protect the developing brain. Ideally, they ban it from me too. I need to be off that phone too. But yeah, I think definitely for children and teenagers. Yeah.
Because it's such a worry, because there seems to be a growing movement actually across Europe that while there's an acknowledgement that sort of developing technologies, AI could actually have a place in the classroom, there's a real movement to banning mobile devices in the classroom, and that seems to be gaining traction because of this awareness of the damage that it's causing to an entire generation.
Yes, and I saw that research that came out. I think that this week, was it Sweden? It was definitely one of those sort of Nordic countries who've gone from books all the way to devices and all the way back to books. But I would say I tried to find the research basis for that decision, and I couldn't find it. I couldn't find evidence that demonstrated that learning was less effective with using technology. I think what we're conflating, we're like grouping all technology as though it's the same. And I think that we need to be careful about that. We need to be more strategic than that. We need to be like, there is a big difference between orange juice and vodka, right? And like, it's not that we take all the drinks away, right? We have to be more strategic about identifying what is the problematic technology and what is the technology that actually not only is helping them learn, but that they need to learn to manage. And I don't think they can learn to manage social media. Like, I don't, because I can't choose to come off it. So if I can't, as an adult who's grown up without that neurological processing, how can they? But they don't spend, let me tell you, we've not got a problem with kids sitting on Excel, like obsessively, like that's not the problem, right? It's a very different mechanism. And I think I saw that and I tried to find the scientific research to underpin it. And it looked to me actually like a cultural decision rather than a scientific decision.
Is it up to the tech companies to be more responsible? Do we need to legislate? What are the solutions, or is it too late?
I don't think we can ever say something is too late. When we introduced, cocaine used to be taken as just a pick-me-up, right? Like, Freud was all over the idea of like opiates just as a general way of managing life. So we have learned at different points, like actually something that technologies tend to come out and then we realize this has got more side effects than we realized, and we need to think more strategically about how we manage them. So I don't think it's too late. I think we just need to think about it. And I think, I think your point, if you imagine like, the student spends like all of their spare time in their room on their own on a computer or on a device. Interestingly, the research shows that it's much more problematic, social media, for girls than it is for boys. And one of the reasons that they find that is that when boys are on computers, they tend more to be on computer games. And when they're on the computer games, they're actually in voice chat. So they're talking to their friends verbally whilst they're playing a computer game. Whereas the girls are on social media on their own scrolling. Mm-hmm. And there is a very distinct difference in the negative impact of those two behaviors. So because when they're playing computer games and they're talking to their friends, they're actually developing social skills and like how they navigate, and they're working together on a collective problem. And there's actually some positives in there. Whereas like just doom scrolling on TikTok really has no upside. I think that the first thing I'd say is that, not all things are equal. I do think there is a problem, though, if I was talking about boys, and I've worked predominantly in co-ed, around the kind of, and all students, that there is, it is less difficult to navigate relationships just through voice, for example, or just online, than it is person to person. There is less kind of skill that you need to develop. There's less social anxiety and everything. And what we're seeing is when children and adults have the choice to do the easier thing, some of them will take it because they want to avoid the anxiety of actually how difficult it is to learn to develop face-to-face friendships. But again, our brain is designed for those face-to-face friendships, and there is a cost when you don't have it. And that cost is loneliness and isolation. And when you get loneliness and isolation, then you get a whole load of other things we could talk about maybe another time, like the kind of radicalizing impact of technology and what we're really seeing in terms of negative gender stuff for boys, taking them down a rabbit hole of very problematic gender stuff, which is driven from this feeling of isolation, loneliness, and lack of being valued, which is connected to being isolated, which is connected to the fact that it's easier to spend time on technology than it is to learn the social skills. So there's a lot of things we need to unpick. We have allowed our culture and our culture's relationship to technology to develop organically. The drivers of that are companies who are trying to get us to use technology and make it as addictive as possible, and no one else has interfered in that relationship. So until we interfere in that relationship, the key drivers are whatever my brain finds easiest and most delicious, and whatever they can create that's more delicious. And there's nothing else in play, right? So we have to think about that.
Do you see the effects of children's screen use outside of school impacting the classroom?
Yeah, I think so. Like, well, I mean, you see it first of all in, all humans. If we ask anybody whether they are worse behaved when they're driving a car than when they're standing in a shopping line, they'll all say they're worse behaved driving that car, right? Anonymity brings out worse behaviors in human beings. That's a long stated psychological fact. And online, therefore, provides anonymity that allows everybody, and you can see this with adults on Twitter, to have a lack of empathy for the person they're speaking to, and to be incautious in the language and the tone in which they communicate in a way they would never do to someone's face. And when you have teenagers or children, that obviously plays out, right? So like, children won't think about, when you remove those kind of pieces, that will affect kids too. And so you get behavior outside of school on social media that's really unkind sometimes. And that will drift into the dynamics of schools. And so all schools work really hard to try and get kids to proactively think about that. But adults don't think about it. We can look at it on Twitter. So asking our young people to be, so I think that's kind of one challenge. The second challenge, when I banned mobile phones, I had a really intelligent and articulate young woman come in to see me to tell me why it was a terrible idea that I'm banning mobile phones. And part of her argument was that was what calmed her down. And my argument to her, which I think to a degree she accepted, I have to ask her now, is it doesn't calm you down. It's like saying having a cigarette calms you down. It's because you're meeting your addiction. Like, it doesn't calm you down. It puts you into a state of numbness, right? Being on that scrolling is numbness. So we have a problem where our children are spending too much time numb and not enough time bored. We are designed to be bored. It is what our brains are designed to do. It's where creativity is born. It's where we get the impulse to do things that are difficult, like have social conversations, is from the position of boredom. And we're taking away young people having boredom outside of school. If we all remember growing up, we're like, Mom, I'm so bored. Kids don't say that anymore. They just get a device. So there's also a piece there where our children spending all their time outside of school numb rather than bored affects their learning.
My parents-in-law are psychologists in France, and they said to me when the boys were little, they gave me a book saying basically no screen time is good, and they were showing the neurological effects of television. And now I feel like we've moved, and at the time I was a little bit dismissive, and I thought, it's okay if they watch a little bit of TV, but now I can see how quickly it has escalated. It's frightening. It's frightening as a parent. It's frightening to see the impact on children, on their mental health. As you said, some of the kind of big players in the tech industry are voicing concerns, but no one seems to be doing anything.
Yes. I think that's right. And I think it's because it would be deeply unpopular. Because like the truth is, and I don't have children myself, but I have two delightful nieces. And if we really need some calm adult time, the best thing to do is to give them the iPad,
Do you
right?
know what?
And
It's a painful truth. It's a painful
it is.
truth.
And so therefore it's working for everyone. Like the kids love it, the parents get some downtime. So it is very difficult in those moments of immense stress when you're raising young children to not do this. And I think we have created a society that is so intense and fast paced that everybody is basically in a state of stress the whole time, that this almost becomes a solution to that stress in a really unhealthy way. But given that we're so stressed, we don't really have time for healthy. So it's like we've created a cultural problem that perpetuates this. So I think the why politicians don't do anything is because it would probably be quite unpopular. And I would say two things. The first is a caveat, right? There is not clear evidence yet of this being addictive in the way, because it's very difficult to generate that evidence. Like actually to get neurological evidence on the proving point of addiction is really difficult. But I would feel confident making that parallel because you can see all the behaviors of addiction. Like when you take that device away from children, they don't, as I'm saying, you can see the reaction, you can see the need, you can see, even in myself, but in others, the kind of numbing effect of being on it. So I think it is, and it also makes just sense in terms of the networks that we know are involved. So I would first of all caveat by saying that I'm not a scientist that specializes in this area. It's just as a teacher, this is what it looks like. But we've become very clear about the rise in mental health problems. And so when I speak to like parents of teenagers, it can be overwhelming, like dealing with their child's mental health issues. So on one side, we've got the pressure of it's much easier to give technology. On the other side, we've got this overwhelming difficulty, particularly in teenage years of mental health issues. And then the solution is they should do 15 minutes mindfulness a day, which for me is just like a sticking plaster. Like, you know, we can see an exponential rise in anxiety and depression in young people that correlates directly with the advent of smartphones. We can see causal evidence now that shows the amount of time they're spending on social media directly relates to their anxiety and mental health. And then really the solution we want is to not take away the devices because that creates too much friction, but instead to get them to do mindfulness or go and see a therapist. Like there's just a truth here of like, if we actually want to grasp this problem, then the treatment is going to be painful socially. And it's just hard.
And I mean, and I said, you know, no one seems to be doing anything. To be fair, in the UK, they have just passed the online safety bill, and that's aimed at tackling some of these problems that we're talking about. But again, often with these things, the laws develop nowhere near the same pace as technology.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And I think, you know, when we go back to our original question around, so I am worried about the mental health piece, but I'm more worried about, at the moment, about the impact AI is going to have on democracy and on employment. And when we look at those, which I think are the most pressing concerns globally for any country, I can't see that governments are paying the proportionate and appropriate amount of attention to that.
Education's underfunded across the world. Teachers are increasingly hard to recruit, and AI threatens for some people to certainly to unravel learning as we know it. So do you feel that it is the perfect storm at the moment for education?
It's a moment, if we could slow it down, it would be an exciting moment. I think it's the combination of the challenge with the speed of the challenge that makes it tricky, because there are unintended, like, you know, we have a system that has worked well for the last 200 years. Radical change in that system always leads to unintended consequences. And so if you're going to adapt something, you would want to do it slowly and strategically. At the same time, the children that come into my year 7 this year will graduate from school in 2030 at the point of the climate change agreement supposedly being passed, at the point where AI will have dramatically reshaped the world. So I just don't have much time to change. If I keep giving the education I was giving 200 years ago, I'm not giving them what they need. So I think it's there are a lot of challenges. I do feel like the best that I can do in my little bit of the world is to very authentically and bravely, as an institution, engage with the challenge and try and do our best to be flexible ourselves, to be brave ourselves, and to try and give the girls the skills that they need, and to have conversations and to encourage other organizations to exert pressure on governments, to think strategically about how we ensure that the future for our children is there. And, you know, we can do the stuff where we're like, okay, these are the skills gaps, or these are the things they're going to need to do, and we can try and teach them. But they have to take responsibility for ensuring that our economies are stable, that our democracies are stable, given that the threats are very, very significant and will move very, very rapidly.
So, and you talked a little bit about the solutions, but what other sort of solutions are there as you see them?
In education, or more widely? Yeah,
well, I suppose really, specifically with regards to education, but also perhaps with regards to AI and perhaps smartphones and things.
Yes. So I think, I mean, in terms of education, we have to fundamentally consider what we're teaching and why. So for us, solutions that we've engaged, you know, we've already like invested in technology. We're a Microsoft Showcase school. We have been for the last 3 years, like a handful in the UK. We're working with organizations like UCL and Intel to ensure that our girls are understanding what it means to have machine learning, what these technologies mean. My first day in post, my head of Latin, amazing woman, resigned, and we replaced that curriculum, which is hard because I love Latin, but we replaced that curriculum with future ready curriculum like coding, like design thinking. We're launching a parallel curriculum to run alongside A levels, which we are calling Pathways, which will allow the girls to pick alternative pathways, which will give them the skills and practical skills. We're going to be changing our the way that for example, even the way our teaching system works. So like tutor groups, if you think about them, are like these big groups. And so in sixth form, as of next year, we're going to be rethinking our tutor groups. So we're actually getting rid of tutor groups. Every child we paired with an adult who's on the journey with them, having mentoring conversations, helping them to think about how they build deeper skills. We need to change. I had a meeting this morning thinking about changing what our assessment things are, what our reporting things are, because what you measure is what people, teachers, students, and parents focus on as important. So there's a lot of opportunities, and it's a very exciting time. What you've got to make sure you do is don't lose the baby with the bathwater, right? Like there are really valuable things in our current education system. History teaches you how to separate truth from noise. We're going to need that in this era of deep fake technology. Like that's an incredibly valuable skill. Like maths teaches you problem solving and logical deductive thinking. Like that is really important. So like we want to make sure that we maintain the power of what has always been part of our education system, but let go of the stuff that's been focused on just simply getting things right, knowledge, organization, compliance, and move into a culture which will be difficult for schools, where we're developing more individual thoughts, risk-taking, individual voice, boldness, ability to influence and lead, self-management, self-regulation, all of those things.
Well, and is there anything else that I haven't mentioned that you'd like to sort of talk about or like to mention before we go?
I suppose, given particularly our conversation, I think one of the big opportunities at this moment, and for Guernsey as well, is that we are quite a tightly woven community with really interesting stakeholders, lots and lots of different types of people. Like I had a meeting this morning with just an extraordinary business leader. I get to meet people who are changing the world all over the place. So I think this opportunity for us to work together is really unique. I also think some of the democratic challenges that are really going to undermine Western liberal democracies are going to be less relevant in Guernsey. Like fake news is less relevant when you can literally go down to the front of St. Peter's Port and realize it's not true, right? So we have opportunities here. And for me, one of the things that we need to think about is in education is fraying the edges of schools. Like we are all going to have to work and learn extremely fast. I genuinely think we're moving into a period of change that is perhaps unprecedented in human history. So the best thing we can do is do it together. And I'd like to see like the fraying of the edges of schools. I want to work with different organizations and business partners. I want the girls to have that connection so that we can all make sure that our next generation is equipped with the skills they need.